Have you eaten today? The voice reached Evelyn Harper just as she stepped away from the bakery window. She had lingered too long, watching fresh bread disappear into other people's hands until the baker turned the sign to closed without meeting her eyes. She pulled her worn coat tighter and started toward the end of the boardwalk. It was easier to keep walking than to stand where everyone could measure her hunger. Two ladies leaving the mercantile lowered their voices as she passed. One gathered her little girl closer. Evelyn kept her eyes on the dusty planks beneath her boots. She had learned that dignity sometimes meant pretending not to hear what people believed they had whispered softly enough. The man who had spoken stood beside a bay horse, tightening the cinch with practiced hands. Dust covered his boots, and the sleeves of his work shirt had been repaired more than once. Nothing about him invited conversation, yet nothing urged her away. He simply waited. "No," Evelyn answered at last. It was the first honest word she had spoken to anyone that day. The rancher gave a small nod, crossed to the bakery door, and knocked once. A few moments later, the baker returned carrying a dark rye loaf wrapped in brown paper. The rancher paid, thanked him, and walked to a weathered bench near the feed store. He placed the loaf beside a steaming tin cup of coffee, then stepped back to check the left foreleg of his horse, giving her room to decide without an audience. Evelyn remained where she was. Pride could keep a woman standing longer than strength ever could. The smell of warm bread drifted toward her, carrying a memory she had not expected. Her mother standing beside a wood stove, flour dust on worn sleeves, a loaf cooling beneath a clean towel before winter had taken both the farm and the woman who had made it feel like home. She walked to the bench slowly and sat at the far end. Before taking a bite, she broke the loaf in two and wrapped the larger piece again. Tomorrow had a way of arriving even when supper had not. She warmed her hands around the coffee before drinking. Across the street, the rancher finished checking the horse, brushed a little dried mud from its fetlock, and finally came over. "Nathan Brooks," he said. His voice was quiet, as though names were things to be offered rather than announced. Evelyn looked up. He did not ask where she had come from. He did not ask why she was alone. He only glanced at the untouched half-loaf resting beside her. "The stove in my bunkhouse has not been cleaned since spring," he said. "The hens need tending. The porch needs sweeping. Honest work earns honest meals." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. There was no bargain hidden beneath the words. Only work, only supper, only tomorrow. She rose with the wrapped bread tucked carefully inside her coat. "Evelyn Harper," she replied. Nathan lifted her small cloth bundle, testing its weight without opening it, and fastened it behind the saddle. Then, instead of handing her the reins after he mounted, he placed them gently in her hands and started walking beside the horse. They left town at the same pace, neither one hurrying the other. Behind them, the bakery lights faded into evening. Ahead stretched 3 miles of open prairie, a fading sun, and a road that, for the first time in many months, did not lead Evelyn farther away from everyone. It led somewhere someone expected work to be done tomorrow. The ranch appeared at dusk, a low house with a narrow porch, a red barn, and a bunkhouse standing beyond the cottonwoods. Nathan took the reins at the gate and led the bay toward the barn. Evelyn followed with her bundle under one arm and the wrapped bread still inside her coat pocket. No lamp burned in the bunkhouse. Nathan opened the door, struck a match, and lit the stove before he brought in anything else. The room held 2 iron cots, a washstand, a table, and dust enough to show it had not been used since spring. He set a broom against the wall, placed a bucket beside the door, and showed her where the woodpile stood. Then he left. No instructions beyond what the work required. Evelyn removed her coat and began with the stove. She cleared the cold ashes, wiped the iron plate, and checked the flue before laying a small fire. The broom handle was rough, but the floor came clean beneath it. She shook the blankets outside, washed the table, and folded one cot tight enough that a coin might have rested on it without rolling. By the time Nathan returned, the room smelled of pine smoke instead of neglect. He carried a basin of warm water in one hand and a covered plate in the other. Beans, salt pork, and 2 biscuits. He set them on the table, glanced once around the room, and gave a single nod. Evelyn took the larger biscuit and placed it beside the remaining half loaf. "For morning," she said. Nathan did not tell her to eat more. He only left the basin and closed the door behind him. At first light, she was already at the hen house. She found 3 loose boards along the lower wall and stacked flat stones against them before scattering feed. One hen limped. Evelyn caught it carefully, cleaned the foot, and wrapped it with a narrow strip torn from the inside hem of her petticoat. Nathan saw the bandage when he came with the water bucket. He crouched, checked the work, and stood again. "She will keep the foot," he said. It was the first praise he had given her, and it was spoken like a fact. At supper, he set 2 bowls on the kitchen table instead of carrying hers to the bunkhouse. Evelyn stopped at the doorway. The chair across from him was plain, one rung repaired with rawhide. Nathan poured coffee into a second cup and placed it there. He did not invite her with words. He simply sat, broke the loaf she had saved, and left half within her reach. For the next 6 mornings, the second coffee cup waited in the same place. Evelyn never assumed it was hers. She finished the hens, swept the porch, carried kindling to the kitchen, and only then stepped inside. Nathan poured without asking. She drank after the work was done. On the 3rd day, she found the flour tin nearly empty and the biscuit jar holding only crumbs. She said nothing. That afternoon, after gathering eggs, she traded 6 at the mercantile for a small measure of flour and a pinch of yeast. By supper, a plain loaf cooled near the stove, its crust uneven but sound. Nathan came in with dust on his shoulders and stopped beside the table. Evelyn kept her hands busy with the bowls. "The hens paid for it," she said. He looked at the bread, then at the basket of eggs by the door. "Good trade." He washed at the basin and sat across from her. No praise beyond that. Still, he cut the loaf carefully, as though it deserved care. Their days settled into useful order. Nathan repaired fence along the south pasture. Evelyn cleaned the tack room, patched 2 grain sacks, and began keeping count of the eggs in a small ledger she found beneath the kitchen shelf. She marked every sale and every handful used. Nothing disappeared without a line beside it. At the end of the week, Nathan studied the page, took a pencil from his pocket, and added the price of feed at the bottom. He left the ledger open between them. It was the first thing on the ranch that belonged to both their hands. On Sunday, a wagon rolled into the yard carrying Nathan's widowed sister, Ruth, and her 8-year-old son, Eli. The boy climbed down slowly, watching Evelyn from beneath the brim of an oversized hat. Ruth's eyes moved from the swept porch to the bread on the table, and then to the second coffee cup near Nathan's place. She asked no questions. Eli did. "Do you live here?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around the dishcloth. Nathan was outside lifting a trunk from the wagon. She could have said no. She could have called herself hired help. Instead, she looked toward the bunkhouse beyond the cottonwoods. "I work here," she said. Eli considered that, then set a small wooden horse on the table beside her coffee cup. One wheel was missing from its little cart. "Can you fix things?" Evelyn turned it over in her palm. The axle had split cleanly, and the carved horse had been handled smooth by years of use. "Some things." She found a sliver of oak in Nathan's scrap box, shaped it with a kitchen knife, and fitted the wheel before supper. Eli rolled the horse across the table twice, then left it beside her plate as though that was where it belonged. Nathan saw it when he came in. His gaze rested on the toy, then on Evelyn's hands. He placed a 3rd cup on the shelf for Ruth and a smaller tin one beside Eli's chair. Evelyn's cup remained where it had been. No one moved it. Ruth and Eli stayed 3 days. By the second morning, Evelyn knew which floorboard near the stove complained under a heavy step, where Ruth kept the coffee grounds, and how Eli liked his biscuit split so the steam could escape before he bit into it. She did not take charge of the house. She washed first. Then she worked where the work was waiting. Ruth washed clothes at the back pump. Evelyn carried the wet sheets to the line and pinned them where the wind would not tear them loose. Eli brought kindling in armfuls too large for him, dropping half across the porch. Evelyn showed him how to stack the smaller pieces inside the crook of one arm. He tried again. This time, none fell. Nathan spent those days replacing a section of roof over the north stall. He came in late for supper with tar on one sleeve and a split in the cuff of his work coat. Evelyn noticed it when he reached for the bread. She said nothing until morning. After the hens were fed, she took the coat from its peg, matched the thread as closely as she could, and stitched the tear with small, even pulls. She reinforced the old mending beside it, then returned the coat before he came in from the barn. Nathan put it on, flexed his wrist once, and looked at the cuff. His eyes moved toward the sewing basket Ruth had left open near the window. Evelyn was measuring flour at the table. "It should hold," she said. "It will," he answered. That afternoon, he repaired the loose latch on the bunkhouse door and fitted a strip of leather along the bottom where cold air had been coming through. He did not mention the coat. She did not mention the latch. The work stood between them, plain and sufficient. Before Ruth left, she carried a folded quilt from the wagon and placed it on Evelyn's cot. The blue squares had faded at the edges, but the batting was thick and the binding sound. "This was Ma's," Ruth said. "Nathan kept it boxed after she passed. It does no good in a box." Evelyn touched one corner, careful not to unfold it too quickly. Nathan was outside checking the wagon wheel. He did not look toward the bunkhouse, though he must have known what Ruth carried there. Evelyn spread the quilt across the cot that evening. It covered the narrow mattress exactly, blue and cream against the rough plank walls. For the first time, she set her cloth bundle beneath the bed instead of keeping it beside the door. The next morning, Eli's wooden horse waited on the kitchen table. He had forgotten it in his hurry. Evelyn picked it up and carried it to the porch, intending to place it with Ruth's things before the wagon left. Eli saw her coming and shook his head. "Keep it here," he said, "for when I come back." Nathan tightened the last strap on the trunk. Ruth climbed onto the wagon seat. Evelyn stood with the little horse in her hand while the wheels turned toward the road. When she returned inside, Nathan had set the toy beside her coffee cup. The repaired wheel faced outward, ready to roll. After Ruth and Eli returned home, the ranch settled into its familiar rhythm, but the quiet felt different now. The third coffee cup remained on the shelf instead of being put away. Eli's little wooden horse stayed beside the stove, waiting for the next Sunday without anyone deciding it should. Evelyn noticed these things the same way she noticed a loose fence rail or an empty flour barrel. They belonged to the work of keeping a place alive. The hens laid well through the last weeks of autumn, and each evening Evelyn entered every egg, every sack of feed, and every penny earned into the ledger beneath the kitchen lamp. One night, she paused over the figures. Feed cost more than it had a month before. Flour had risen too. She closed the book, carried a lantern outside, and walked behind the hen house until she found a strip of ground protected from the north wind by the barn. The soil stayed darker there after rain. The next morning, before sunrise, Nathan found 3 straight rows marked into the earth with a hoe. Evelyn was carrying wash water from the house instead of throwing it into the yard. She poured it carefully along the furrows. Nathan watched for a moment before asking, "Planning ahead?" "Trying to spend less by spring," she answered without looking up. He studied the slope of the ground, then disappeared into the workshop. By evening, he had built a narrow wooden trough beneath the kitchen, drain that carried wash water into a rain barrel beside the garden rows. Neither of them called it a gift. It simply made the work easier. The small garden became their shared habit. Evelyn planted turnips first, then onions, saving every seed she could. Nathan stretched an old section of fence around the plot to keep wandering chickens out. When she traded eggs in town, she came home with flour, lamp oil, and cabbage seed instead of ribbons or cloth. When he repaired harnesses for neighboring ranches, he quietly brought back another packet of bean seed and laid it beside the ledger without mentioning where it had come from. Their kindness traveled in useful directions. One morning, Evelyn found a new pair of sturdy work gloves hanging beside the kitchen door, sized for her hands. She wore them without asking who had bought them. 2 days later, Nathan reached for his coat before daylight and discovered the worn cuff had been reinforced again with careful stitches that matched the old thread so closely he almost missed them. Neither spoke of either gift. The work itself carried the thanks. Sundays slowly became something Eli counted by sleeping rather than days on a calendar. His wooden horse rolled across the porch boards while Ruth peeled apples beside Evelyn at the kitchen table. Nathan split firewood near enough to hear Eli practicing his reading aloud through the open window. Whenever the boy stumbled over a difficult word, Evelyn waited. She never hurried him. Nathan never interrupted either. By late afternoon, jars of apple preserves cooled across the table, fresh bread rested beneath a clean towel, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon, yeast, and wood smoke. Ruth looked around the room while tying the last jar with cloth. For coffee cups waited beside 4 plates before anyone had been called to supper. She smiled quietly. This house feels lived in again. Evelyn lowered her eyes and folded the dish towel. Nathan said nothing. He simply pulled another chair closer to the table before carrying in one more armload of firewood. That evening, after Eli fell asleep with his head resting against Evelyn's shoulder, she remained perfectly still so he would not wake. Nathan covered the boy with the blue quilt that had once belonged to his mother, then set another split loaf of bread in the center of the table for breakfast. Before blowing out the lamp, he left Evelyn's coffee cup beside the stove exactly where she would find it at dawn. By morning, she would fill it without thinking. Some habits no longer belonged to one person. They belonged to the home they were quietly building together. By the first hard frost, Ruth and Eli had fallen into the habit of arriving every Sunday after church. Eli no longer asked where he should leave his coat. He hung it beside Nathan's, carried his wooden horse inside, and reached automatically for the small tin cup that always waited for him on the lowest shelf. No one had planned those places. They had simply remained the same until they belonged to someone. One Sunday, Eli climbed down from the wagon holding his school satchel close against his side. Beans spilled across the porch as he stepped up. The bottom seam had given way. He looked down at the scattered beans before looking at Ruth, already apologizing with his eyes. Evelyn knelt without a word. Together they gathered every bean from between the porch boards. That afternoon, she turned an empty flour sack inside out, cut a clean piece of canvas, and stitched a new bottom into the satchel using heavy thread meant for harness repairs. When she finished, she rubbed beeswax along the seams to help keep out spring rain. Eli filled it with both of his primers, a slate and a small apple. The stitching held. "It will last a good while," she said. Eli smiled, slung it over his shoulder, and ran outside to prove her right. Nathan watched from the workbench where he was fitting a new handle onto an old hammer. He said nothing, but later that evening Evelyn found a fresh spool of strong thread resting beside her sewing basket. No explanation. She placed it with the needles she already owned. Their thanks had learned to travel without words. The garden gave them a modest harvest before the ground froze. Turnips, onions, and enough cabbage to fill several jars. Evelyn entered every basket in the ledger, subtracting the cost of seed, before adding the value of what they had saved by growing it themselves. Nathan stood beside her after supper, studying the neat columns beneath the lamp. "You made the ground earn its keep," he said quietly. The next afternoon, he widened the fence another 10 feet and stacked extra cedar posts beside it for spring. He never announced the decision. Evelyn understood it anyway. The little patch of earth was no longer an experiment. It had become part of the ranch. As winter settled over the prairie, Ruth caught a stubborn cough after helping neighbors butcher hogs before the first deep snow. Evelyn moved her into the warm bedroom near the kitchen stove and carried her own blankets back to the bunkhouse. Nathan noticed before dark. He loaded an extra armful of firewood onto the sled without mentioning the reason. Before dawn the next morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of the bunkhouse door opening softly. Nathan rebuilt the dying fire, set another split log beside the stove, and left before she had fully opened her eyes. When she returned to the house after feeding the hens, his coffee already waited beside the stove. She poured hers only after filling his cup first. Neither acknowledged the exchange. It had become as ordinary as lighting the morning fire. Ruth slowly regained her strength. While she rested, Eli spent his afternoons at the kitchen table reading aloud. Whenever he stumbled over a difficult sentence, Evelyn let the silence linger until he found the words himself. Nathan worked nearby repairing bridles, pretending not to listen, though every now and then the corner of his mouth lifted before he bent back over the leather. One snowy afternoon, Eli fell asleep with his head resting on an open primer. Evelyn eased the book from beneath his cheek and covered him with the blue quilt. Nathan came in carrying a bucket of fresh water. He stood quietly in the doorway for a moment, watching the boy sleep beneath his mother's quilt, and Evelyn straightened the edge beneath his shoulder as though she had done it all her life. Without saying anything, Nathan climbed to the loft before supper and returned carrying a small cedar chest. He placed it beside the bunkhouse bed. "You should not have to keep living out of a bundle," he said simply. After he left, Evelyn untied the faded cloth she had carried since arriving in town. 2 dresses, a comb, her mother's thimble, and the folded paper wrapping from the first loaf of bread Nathan had bought for her were still inside. She touched the paper once before laying each belonging carefully into the cedar chest. The cloth bundle, empty now, remained folded at the bottom. For the first time since losing everything, she had somewhere worth unpacking. The first heavy snow arrived before dawn, covering the porch steps and burying the garden beneath a smooth white blanket. By sunrise, Nathan had already cleared a narrow path to the barn. Evelyn came from the bunkhouse carrying the second shovel. She did not ask where to begin. She simply started beside him, widening the trail to the hen house before the birds grew restless. Their shovels found an easy rhythm, each one lifting where the other had left off. By mid-morning, the sound of wagon wheels struggling through deep snow reached the yard. Ruth's team had nearly stopped in a drift less than a quarter-mile from the house. Nathan harnessed his strongest pair without hesitation. Evelyn was already gathering blankets, hot bricks wrapped in old towels, and a kettle of coffee for the return trip. Neither gave directions. They had learned each other's work by doing it together. Ruth and Eli reached the house cold and tired but smiling with relief. One wagon wheel had broken a wooden pin, leaving the team unable to travel until Nathan could shape another from seasoned oak. That meant several unexpected days beneath the same roof. The house grew fuller instead of smaller. Eli stacked firewood before anyone asked. Ruth peeled potatoes while sitting near the stove. Evelyn baked bread from the last of the week's flour, measuring every cup carefully because the roads might remain closed longer than anyone expected. Nathan repaired the broken wagon pin at the kitchen table after supper, wood shavings gathering beside the lamp while Eli watched every careful cut. Before turning in that evening, Nathan carried another armload of split oak to the porch. He reached for the latch just as Evelyn came outside with the empty coffee pot. "There is enough for tonight," she said. Nathan glanced toward the woodpile half hidden beneath snow. "Tomorrow we'll need some too." Evelyn looked at the wind driving fresh snow across the yard. Without another word, she picked up the smaller basket and followed him. They carried wood until the porch rack stood full. The next morning, the north barn roof sagged beneath wet snow. The livestock had to be moved before more weight settled on the beams. Nathan climbed into the loft to brace the rafters while Evelyn opened the lower stalls and led the Mares one at a time into the smaller barn. Eli carried lanterns between buildings. Ruth spread fresh straw and filled feed troughs. No one stopped to discuss whose task belonged to whom. By late afternoon, the last gate had been secured. Nathan climbed down from the loft more slowly than usual, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. He started toward the tool shed. Evelyn stepped into his path and quietly took the hammer from his hand. "The roof will still be there after supper," she said. "Your hands may not." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Together they walked back to the house. Evelyn heated water, wrapped warm cloths around his hands, and placed a bowl of stew beside his chair before serving herself. Ruth noticed the exchange over the rim of her coffee cup, but returned to peeling carrots without comment. That evening, Eli fell asleep with his head against Nathan's shoulder before the story was finished. Nathan carefully lifted the boy, but before he reached the bedroom, Evelyn had already opened the door and turned back the blue quilt. They tucked Eli in together without speaking. Later, after the lamps had been lowered, Evelyn opened the ledger to count what food remained if the storm lasted another week. A folded letter slipped from between the pages. It was the offer of steady work in Cheyenne, written weeks before the first snowfall. She read it once beside the fading fire. Outside, the wind rattled the porch rail. Inside, Nathan had left tomorrow's bread rising beneath a clean towel because he knew she would bake it at first light. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the ledger instead of into the stove. Then she wrote next spring's seed order on the page beside it. When Nathan came in from checking the barn one last time, he saw the fresh list written in her careful hand. He said nothing. He simply picked up a pencil, added 2 more rows of beans beneath her onions, and closed the ledger with both of their plans safely inside. The road opened enough for travel 4 days later. Nathan hitched the wagon before sunrise and loaded the eggs, 2 jars of apples, and the finished leather work he meant to trade in town. Evelyn carried the ledger beneath her coat. The letter from Cheyenne remained folded inside it. She had not answered. At the mercantile, Mr. Talbot counted the eggs twice and looked past Evelyn toward Nathan. "Your hired girl keeps a neat account," he said. Evelyn's hand rested on the ledger cover. Nathan set the jars on the counter. "Miss Harper keeps the ranch accounts," he said. "The garden, hens, and household trade are hers to manage. Mr. Talbot looked at her then. Not through her. At her. He opened the ledger, read the figures, and adjusted the price he had offered for the eggs by 2 cents a dozen. Evelyn checked his arithmetic before she closed the book. Outside, the same 2 women who had watched her near the bakery stood beside the hitching rail. Their eyes moved over her mended coat and work gloves, then to Nathan. One of them asked whether he still needed a housekeeper now that winter had settled in. Nathan tightened the strap on a feed sack. I do not employ Miss Harper as a housekeeper. The woman waited for more. Nathan gave her none. He lifted the sack into the wagon and held the rail steady while Evelyn climbed onto the seat. At the stage office, the clerk called her name through the open door. A reply was due for the Cheyenne position. Evelyn stepped down with the folded letter in her hand. Nathan remained beside the wagon. He did not ask what she intended. Inside, she requested paper and wrote only that she would not be coming. She paid the postage herself from the egg money recorded beside her name. When she returned, Nathan had moved the feed sacks to make room beneath the seat for her feet. They rode home with little said between them. At the ranch, Ruth's wagon stood near the porch. Eli ran out before they had stopped and held up the wooden horse. Nathan had made it a new cart from oak scraps, with 4 even wheels and a handle long enough for the boy to pull. Eli dragged it through the snow, circling Evelyn twice before asking whether she would be there when the garden was planted. Evelyn looked toward the narrow rows buried beneath white ground. Yes, she said. 1 word. Enough. At supper, Ruth placed 4 bowls on the table. Nathan came in last, carrying a small brass key. He set it beside Evelyn's coffee cup. The house door sticks in cold weather, he said. Lift before you turn it. Evelyn looked at the key, then at him. It was not permission for another night. It was access without asking. She slipped it onto the plain cord that held her mother's thimble and tucked both beneath her collar. Nathan took the chair across from her, then paused. Eli had already filled it with his books. Without comment, Nathan moved to the chair beside Evelyn instead. He broke the bread, placed the larger half near her hand, and began discussing where the spring fence should run. Spring reached the ranch one quiet morning at a time. Snow disappeared from the fence posts. Then from the garden rows Nathan had marked beside Evelyn's careful notes in the ledger. The onions were the first to push through the dark soil. Eli insisted on checking them every Sunday, kneeling beside the little shoots as though watching them would help them grow faster. Nathan smiled each time without saying so. The cedar chest had long since replaced the old cloth bundle. Evelyn's dresses hung inside the small room off the kitchen. Her sewing basket rested beneath the window Nathan had repaired before winter ended, and her mother's thimble lay beside the brass key on the shelf above it. She had not noticed when she stopped thinking of the bunkhouse as home. One morning, she simply woke in the house before sunrise, stirred the stove back to life, and found Nathan already grinding coffee at the table. He handed her the kettle without speaking. She filled it while he sliced yesterday's bread. The movements belonged to both of them now. After breakfast, they worked the garden together. Nathan set the fence posts while Evelyn tied young bean vines with soft strips cut from worn flour sacks. When one row leaned after a strong afternoon wind, he straightened the stakes. She pressed the loosened earth firmly around each root. Neither finished the other's work. They simply made it easier to continue. That Sunday, Ruth arrived carrying a basket of early strawberries. Eli ran straight to the porch where his wooden horse still waited on its familiar nail beside the garden gate. He laughed because someone had tied a tiny scrap of blue cloth around its neck. Evelyn recognized it as a piece left from repairing the old quilt. Nathan never admitted who had tied it there. By afternoon, the porch table held fresh bread, strawberry preserves, and 4 steaming coffee cups. Ruth looked around before anyone sat down. We used to visit because Nathan lived here, she said quietly. Now we come because all of you do. No one answered. There was nothing that needed improving. Nathan pulled out Evelyn's chair before taking his own. Eli climbed onto the bench beside her with the wooden horse tucked beneath one arm. Supper stretched longer than usual because no one hurried away when the meal was finished. As the evening cooled, Evelyn gathered the empty plates while Nathan carried the coffee pot back outside instead of into the kitchen. He poured what remained into 2 cups and set one beside her on the porch railing. The fields lay quiet beyond the garden, touched by the last gold light of day. After a while, Nathan broke the final piece of bread in half, just as he had on the evening she first sat at his table. He placed the larger half in Evelyn's hand without thinking. She smiled softly, broke it once more, and returned half to him. It was the first time she had done so. Eli looked up from the porch step, noticed without interrupting, and rested his wooden horse beside the coffee cups before wandering back into the yard. The little toy stood between them while the evening settled around the house. No one spoke about belonging anymore. The open kitchen door, the worn porch boards, the blue quilt folded over the chair inside, the ledger waiting on the table, and the smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill had already said everything that mattered.